Yeah, we're going to just chat. Except I'm on the wrong side, but it's okay. Oh, hey everybody. I'm Cheryl Swift, Duchess of Rock and Roll. I'm here tonight at Sonic Ranch Studio in Tornillo, Texas, in the Neve Room with none other than the man himself, Geoff Emerick.
Hi, everyone. Hi.
I have to say that when you walked in last night, I got a little verklempt because...
No, I remember.
You do remember. That was just
I do.
24 hours ago.
I know.
But
it's very emotional, as you know.
It's very emotional.
Yeah.
I've known your work most of my life, and getting to meet you has been a thrill. So, for people who may not know who you are, which shame on them, would you like to tell them a couple?
No, you tell them.
So
I hate telling them.
Oh,
who I am.
I will tell them who you are. So Geoff Emerick is
at the age of 15, right?
At the age of 15, worked for EMI Studios. So Geoff is one of the engineers for this little band called the Beatles.
Right.
And he's produced and done some of the most amazing work that all of us have in our brains and in our iPods and in our vinyl collections. And getting to meet you is a thrill because in the world of music and engineering, you're really royalty, in my opinion. So the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
So Abbey Road Studios.
Yes.
How many years did you work with them there?
Let's go back. Well, first of all, it was EMI Studios.
Right,
that time,
EMI is where you began, 15.
So it wasn't Abbey Road Studios because that was named Abbey Road after we made the album
Correct.
Abbey Road, right? Which is another story because they're walking away from the studios because they hated it. But Abbey Road thought there's pictures of them walking towards it and there's pictures walking away from it. We've been incarcerated in there for a long time, and the reason the picture of them walking away was the fact they were fed up with the place, right? But that's something that was a conversation within the control room.
Got it.
So anyway, I was there in 1962, right? And 2 days after I started at EMI Studios, they came in, although they'd done their artist test, they'd come in to start recording. It was, well, on that session, I forgot what the song was, but it was by another writer. But that was the day they wanted to, they took the first takes of Love Me Do. So they came in 2 days after I started. And I said to the guy that would start teaching me the ropes of the business, can I sit on session just to see how it all works? They were just a band from Liverpool.
Right, they weren't the Beatles
No.
yet. They're just...
So I sat on the session, and yes, and I didn't realise until afterwards there was a protocol with producers, artists. George Martin was like the schoolmaster. They took their directive from him. Oh, the buzzer's going to go, the red light's going to go. Then you start singing, right? Which was really a nervous situation from the artist, right?
Of course.
Because I remember them giggling around the mic. Because I remember Paul saying to John, he's going to tell us there's going to be a buzzer. He's going to tell us when there's going to be a red light, and then we start singing, right? They were really so nervous. I remember that very first session, right? So from then on, you know, being who I was so young, I was assistant engineer on a lot of George Martin sessions, and Norman Smith, who was the original engineer, because we got on so well mentally and liked each other.
Right.
You know, and George Martin and I had a good sense of humour, which I really have. But also, you don't see it from George because he was officious.
He was very...
But he laughed at everything beneath that sort of facade. Yes.
Yes.
So that's why it worked.
Right.
Yes.
And how many albums did you do with the Beatles? I know it's quite a few of the later work.
Well, yeah, I mean, from when Norman wanted to leave as their engineer, although I found out later that he wanted to carry on engineering the Beatles, but he was then a producer because he found Pink Floyd, right? And he was there working as a producer for EMI Records.
Got it.
And it was only years after I realised why he said to George Martin, well, I want to carry on engineering the Beatles, but it meant there would have been 2 producers per se on the session, and no way was George going to have that.
Right, he was a single.
So anyway, being so young, I'm sure there was discussions behind the scenes with McCartney and other people. Probably put more Paul than anyone. We need someone young, because when I first joined EMI, because I went up the ladder very fast, I used to cut playback lacquers. There was no cassettes in those days for the artists to hear their songs the next day. And then I became a mastering engineer, right? Because I was recutting all the Motown stuff and everything else for the European market.
Okay.
So that gave me an insight into sounds that I knew weren't being recorded within that facility because I was in a room listening to new sounds, right? So I could imply that to the way I wanted to perceive the way I wanted to record if ever I became a recording engineer. So Norman left and I was promoted to a recording engineer like 18 or 19 years old, right? And I took over Norman's artists. The first hit I had was Pretty Flamingo by Manfred Mann.
Really?
Yes. And so anyway, one thing led to another, and after 5 months I was asked to go up to the manager's office because George Martin was up there and he wants to speak to you, and I'm thinking, what have I done wrong, right?
That would be my first inclination.
Yeah, I mean, so the manager said, well, George wants to say something to you, and George said, well, would you like to record the Beatles? And that was the beginning of the Revolver album, and my heart sank. I was so young, and I played a mind game in my head. There was a little bouncy ball that went from yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, and it kept stopping on no. And I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. I'm so young, right? And it went on to yes.
Yes.
So I said, okay. So 2 weeks later, we started to record what was to become the Revolver album. So I was now there, although they knew me because I was assistant engineer on a lot of their single sessions, right?
Right.
So they knew me. It wasn't like a stranger's coming. They knew me,
right?
They knew Geoff. And Paul used to come up into my mastering room in the lunch times when he was working on Rubber Soul, because I wasn't that heavily involved with that. So Paul used to come up into mastering room lunch times, and we used to sit there and talk about music and stuff, right? So that's how our relationship started.
Got it.
So anyway, I ended up doing this. Paul knew I was going to be their new recording engineer. I remember having a microphone open in the studio at that time, on that afternoon, and I heard George Harrison say to George Martin, "Where's Norman?" So my heart sank, because they weren't informed that Norman had left and not being their engineer anymore, and I was now their new engineer.
Ooh.
So anyway, the whatever happened transpired. I'm feeling awful, nauseous, right? Obviously, I'm a kid, right? So we're going back to Tomorrow Never Knows, which was called Mark 1 as a working title. And John being John, said, I want my voice to sound like the Dalai Lama singing on the mountaintop 25 miles away from the studio. That's the way John used to express himself.
Gotcha.
So he's got a sound in his head of this vocal. So I'm thinking, all I've got is like an 8-input mixing console, an echo chamber, and a stereo tape machine. What do you want me to do?
Right, fly you to the...
Well, with no exactly, no selectable equalisation, nothing. So, luckily, it was my saving grace. I guess this is supposed to happen. It's like serendipity, right?
Right.
I'm looking through the control room window into the studio, and there's the Leslie speaker that spins around with the Hammond organ, right? So I'm thinking, well, if we could get into the circuitry of that and put John's voice in a spinning speaker, that would give the sound of this Dalai Lama singing from a mountaintop. So that's what we did. And I contacted Ken Townsend, who was in the maintenance department of EMI at that time, and Ken came down and did the connections and circuitry and adjustments, and that's what we did. And that won John over, and then Ringo wanted a different drum sound, and he wanted this, and Paul, I was well into bass because of listening to American records that had much superior bass on them than the ones that were coming out Abbey Road. So this is a whole,
you
huge
shifted
story.
the sound of the.
Well, yeah.
You shifted the sound, didn't you?
We were breaking down barriers.
Yes.
Really?
I've heard a little bit of a rebel, as in the engineering world, where you took strides.
I was in trouble. I could have been fired tomorrow.
At any moment.
Because what happened with the bass drum situation, I wanted this big upfront punchy bass drum sound.
Right.
And I took the front skin off the bass drum and put that double necks, or that quadruple necked sweater from that, what help was it? Stuffed it in the bass drum and put the front skin back on the bass drum and moved the mic like 4 or 6 inches away from the bass drum to get this big
boom.
Right, which had never been heard before in that perspective.
You're nothing but an innovator.
So, and then load and brought down all the microphones on the drum kits. I was like 3 of them, but just lowered them, and then that gave Ringo the sound he wanted to hear, which was more up front in your face. He didn't want this wishy-washy sound, as he called it, which was on most English records.
Right, it was
like
very playful.
It was like a mic up in the air, and it was a drum kit, So anyway, on that first day, that won him over, Lennon over, and getting over, because Paul and I, as I said, used to converse a few months, year back in my room upstairs, and so we had a relationship, sort of,
Right.
So anyway, that's how it all came about,
That's That's extraordinary.
But I was nauseous and I felt sick and vomiting and God knows what else.
I've been that way before.
It was just the most horrendous day of my life. You know.
I get it.
Yeah.
But you changed. You literally changed the way music was recorded.
Well, that was what my fourth Grammy was for, breaking down barriers and building new frontiers, which was the technical Grammy, you know?
You did win that.
Yes.
I know this for a fact.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, you did. I mean, you know, when you speak to someone who's an innovator, it's almost hard to find the words because you literally shifted the.
I know. To what it is today. I know that. I'm not stupid, but I do realise that today, you know.
But then at the time you didn't know. You were afraid.
No, not at all. Because all I could do to create different sounds was to abuse the equipment that was available. Because the bass drum situation was, Geoff moved the microphone closer to the bass drum, which was against the rules, because of the air pressure against the diaphragm on the microphone.
Right, because you don't want to blow it.
But someone snitched on me and said, "Oh, Geoff's done this." Some older engineer, "Oh, Geoff did this yesterday." Eventually, I got a letter that said, "Geoff, you can do this on Beatles sessions," because there was a big discussion, and eventually everyone wanted to do it. So gradually, we're just breaking. Even on A Day in the Life, when we did the orchestra, which was classical, and although a couple of the main guys in the brass section had done For No One, and also Penny Lane, you know, they were classical guys, right, who played brass. And we're trying to do the orchestra, and I thought, "Oh, we can't do this, and gradually it's the pop against the classical, eventually they relented and did what we wanted. So we started to crumble the barriers between classical and pop. Although the pop records were paying for the classical recordings because they didn't make much money and they were expensive, especially if you're doing an opera straight to stereo, you know.
Right, that's
with
a lot.
with Maria Callas, you know. I mean, who pays for it? I don't know what her record sales were, but I mean, you know.
That's pretty. Yeah, who does?
Yeah.
So you work with the. I don't even have words. I'm like, wow. These are the stories from the vault. Well, so you work with the Beatles.
Yes.
And then it becomes Abbey Road.
After the Abbey Road album.
After the Abbey Road album.
Yes.
And you continue to do records with them, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is one of the best albums in the
came
world.
Before the Abbey Road album.
Right.
Yes. Carried on working with them.
And so, the Beatles, and then you went on to work with Paul in his solo career.
Which only came about because, through the Abbey Road album, I'd left EMI.
Right.
Because I couldn't further my career because of I was so young, and there was no way. It would take like 40 years to get a wage increment, right?
Right.
And I'm thinking, now I can't do anything for 40 years being within this company, except sit in a room for 40 years doing something.
Right.
So I left and joined their company, Apple. Although I went out of the White Album because of what happened, you know, with their after 12 songs when it was getting really bad, and I walked out on them. And Paul said, "We'll come back and do the Abbey Road thing. I want you to come to Apple and undo Magic Alex's mixing, you know, studio, which took 2 years to demolish and rebuild." So I'm at Apple and went back to do, you know, the Abbey Road album. You know.
Yes.
And the thing with the Abbey Road album not being like Pickety was the fact that although I'd worked for EMI for what we're talking about 8 years or whatever, 7 years, I was then classed as an outside engineer, which we do not allow outside engineers to come in, right?
Oh.
So they said, well, we're going to have one of our engineers to sit up front in reception so he can get what would have been his wages or his salary if he had been working on the sessions. Although Philip McDonald, right, because I was still trying to build a studio, took over some of the sessions because I couldn't do them because of building a studio. So anyway, but on the other thing, because I'm talking to the students this afternoon about that, I was not allowed to have my name on the tape boxes or the recording sheets. It's down to somebody else, which was Philip. But that's, you know, I'm up against this all the time, but we were just breaking down gradually by gradually getting respect for the job that we were doing. We couldn't even get credits on the album. The guy that took the front picture was on the album cover. You know, I sat there for 700 hours, whatever it was, working on Pepper. Couldn't get a credit, but the guy that snapped the picture, yeah, fine. You know, it's a long story, as you can imagine.
Yes. just simply mesmerizing. You know, such
Yeah.
a part of the fabric of the music world. It's really one of the best stories that there is.
But now the importance of everyone involved in the recording is now accepted. Except, I mean, it's gone over to the mastering engineer. I mean, the way we used to work was the fact we recorded it, knowing what we would do it on the mix.
Right.
So then it went from someone, did a mix on someone else's recording. Oh, it's a
Right.
hit. So then it became, well, someone's going to record it and someone's going to mix it. That doesn't how it really works. Because when you record it, you know what you want to do when you mix it to make it fantastic. So the
Correct.
person that mixes it from something they never recorded doesn't know how you specifically wanted it to sound eventually.
Right.
So that was a problem. And then the mastering thing, because when we used to do our mixes, our final master mixes, I know I'm going off tangents here for you,
It's perfectly fine.
but when we did our mixes and this happened, you didn't want the mastering engineer to touch the sound of your mix. If he wanted to just tweak it a bit, fine, but just don't touch it. This is the way it
Right.
left the control room. So what happened when we done the Sgt. Pepper album and mixed it, I wrote on the tape box, please transfer flat, right? Which meant to the mastering engineer, don't touch it, just put it on and transfer it flat. The guy that got that box to master it, he went to his manager and his manager went berserk. How dare this guy? But I was a mastering engineer before that. So it wasn't as though I was like talking out of
Right.
So he so anyway, cut long story short, the engineer was never allowed to go into the mastering room with the mastering engineer. So I got permission to sit in with the mastering engineer in case he wanted to touch it, right? Because it was his
Right. His handprint
it's
on your
him.
work.
Well,
right.
but we weren't allowed to. That's what he thought he should do. That's what he did. And so anyway, the manager went absolutely berserk and was chasing me actually around the building because he found out that I'd written this across the tape box. Please transfer flat. How dare you tell my engineers what to do? Blah 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 blah. And like plus 2 dBs at 10k or something. But I was in trouble again, you know.
Right.
You don't touch it once it leaves that control room. Don't touch it.
Right.
Don't start turning it inside out, more bass, more high end, more this, more that. That's how we loved it, just master the thing.
Right.
Right?
Right. I concur.
But now it's gone the other way. Whether it's an inferiority thing with engineers, not good engineers, right? But these younger these younger engineers who now think, well, I'm going to do this, but the guy that masters it can sort the problems out. Right?
Right.
And that's what happens.
It's kind of gone back and
Yeah,
forth
yeah.
in the years.
Yeah.
So it's hard to even follow up with that.
Well, I know.
So do you still talk to Paul?
Occasionally, yes. I
Yes.
still work with him on and off, yeah.
Yes. And did you go on to work with Elvis Costello?
Yes.
Yes. I find him to be extraordinarily talented and
Well,
intriguing.
Imperial Bedroom was like the best thing we ever done, but that was a going back into those days. That was a fresh approach on stuff, you know.
Yes.
The way I perceived him was the fact I used to love his lyrics but could never hear the words, right?
Yes.
So when we started doing Imperial Bedroom, I put his voice way out in front on the monitor mixes as we were recording, and it threw him a wobbler. He couldn't handle to hear his voice that loud in the mix, right? Eventually, after 2 weeks, he accepted the fact, right? And a lot of working with Elvis is very spontaneous because there's no time to do anything on this side. He'll say, I want to change a word there, I want to change the lyric. He's in the studio.
Right.
So that's why I have to work with him. But I approached it in a different way because I wanted to, although at that stage most people were recording at 30 IPS on tape, right, on multi-track, and mixing probably to 30 IPS. I didn't want that, what I refer to as a hi-fi sound. So I recorded it at 15 IPS on multi-track. I mixed it to 15 IPS on quarter inch rather than 30 IPS on half inch.
Got it.
Because it wouldn't suit the music.
Right.
So that's the way I approached it. So, I mean...
Well, you did a great job.
Well, yeah, I mean, everyone says it's the best album we ever made, and sometimes he rejects that, but he knows damn well it was, you know.
Yes.
Yes. And it's so diverse, a lot of the stuff that was going on that album, you know.
Right.
Really crazy stuff.
So, Grammys, you have
just the 4.
Just the 4.
Well, they go back ways. I mean, there's Pepper, Abbey
Right.
Road, and Band on the Run, of course. Yeah.
So great. And then the technical Grammy, correct?
Yes, which was the technical. I mean, Band on the Run came about. I mean, because of Paul. When I was at Apple for 4 years, their company Apple,
Right.
and rebuilt the studio. It worked as a commercial studio for like 2 years. The Beatles never recorded there per se as the Beatles. I mean, Harrison recorded All Things Must Pass on there with,
Right.
with Spector. I did Steelers Wheel there as an engineer, Stuck in the Middle with You, which was one of mine. And I did other things then, an old girl band called Fanny, I did there with Richard Perry. So I did a lot of work down in that studio. And then, I had to leave because business-wise it was sort of collapsing around them. So then Paul never ventured into there for like 4 years. And then when I'd left Apple, he contacted me and said, we were going to do this album, which eventually became Band on the Run,
Yes.
So that's the next time we made contact with each other, basically. He wanted nothing to do with Apple, and I was then employed by Apple.
Right.
All right.
All right. Well,
Well,
on that note, I just want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me, and
no, sure.
it's an honor. It'll be one of the biggest honors of my lifetime that you gave
mine
me
too,
the
because
time.
it's good fun, I know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful place we're at. I know you're here to get some work done, and I have some work to finish. So thank you on behalf of all the people in the world whose lives you've impacted,
Right.
my daughter and myself.
Right.
And I just thank you for the work that you put in.
No, thank you for saying so. No. Was this my best side or was it this side? I don't know.
I'm not sure which one is your best, but I'm Cheryl Swift, Duchess of Rock and Roll. We're here tonight at Sonic Ranch Studios in Tornillo, Texas.
Yeah.
This is Geoff Emerick, but thank you so much.
No.
Thank you so much.
Just a handshake, not a hug.
Thank you so much.